This episode, I'm joined once again by Professor Paul Bishop to discuss his recently published book, Nietzsche's Writing Against Religion and the Crisis of Faith, 20th-Century Christian Reactions and Responses. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for making all this work possible. And if you'd like to keep podcasts running, please find links for the Patreon in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Paul Bishop, thanks once again for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Well, thank you very much indeed, James. Appreciate the invitation.
So we are going to be discussing your most recent book on Friedrich Nietzsche, Nietzsche's Writing Against Religion and the Crisis of Faith, 20th-Century Christian Reactions and Responses. And this was published by Palgrave Macmillan. And so this is a study of broadly the reception of Nietzsche's work in Europe. And more specifically from Christian and I think entirely Catholic Christian thinkers.
Yeah.
And really a textual investigation into how the phrase God is dead, or the notion, the philosophical notion of the death of God, how that landed, and how it was immediately and pretty quickly taken up, and how it was very seriously taken up and not just avoided by Christians, as I think can be the common misconception. Before we dive in, what's the origin of this book?
It comes out of the previous work that I've been doing, looking at discourses of philosophy and philology and theology in Nietzsche, with a particular focus as well on that last great work, one of the last great works, The Antichrist. And as I was writing on these, I kept a little kind of tally of thinkers and commentators with a theological background who'd written on Nietzsche. And I wanted to give it a kind of a separate chapter, and it just kept on mushrooming. I just kept on discovering more and more, and what they said was more and more interesting. And I thought, well, I really want to turn this into a separate study, which even in itself is not complete. And you rightly note, not a bias towards Catholicism, but simply a focus that's there for certain obvious cultural, historical reasons. And really just to try and rescue some of the thinkers that are there who are not talked about as often as they are, and to that extent, I hope it's kind of in line with your project on Hermitix, where you've focused on people like Eric Shivara and given them the attention that they deserve.
Mm-hmm. So these, and it's full with names that are familiar, but not spoken about all that much. Henri de Lubac, as you said, Eric Shivara. Girard, probably the most well-known one in there is Girard, and then some really, really unknown ones in there. So one thing I was thinking about this, though, is that I think there would have been a couple of good, not so academic titles for your book, and one would have been God is Dead, maybe, or God is Dead, ? But I think a better one, just in terms of all the thinkers, which is God is dead, and on the third day he rose again, which is, the very quick Christian response to this.
You're wasted doing this, James. You should be doing marketing, shouldn't you?
Oh dear, it's such a So the reason I say that is just because, and I was thinking about this morning, that I will be brave enough to say that I think this is painting with broad brushstrokes, but I think it's true. The continuation of philosophy post those three words, God is dead or death of God, is pretty much just a footnote, or they are all, in some sense, commentaries onto that declaration and proclamation from Nietzsche, which contained within I can't imagine another three words which contain just as much sort of philosophical prophecy concerning the future of everything. And so that's the first question there, because it's the foundation of everything that's been spoken about, which is, what does death of God commonly mean? And in all your time as a Nietzsche scholar, have there arisen any common misconceptions of what that means?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly it's the spark that lit the fire, as you rightly suggest, and when Nietzsche presents it to us as the words of the madman who's running around at midday with a lamp, and everybody laughs at him. It's an incredibly dramatic scene. It takes something which is an intensely intellectual but also emotional statement and dramatizes it and makes it successful. And I think it's not so much a question of misunderstandings of it, but it requires an awful lot of effort to get to the root of what does it actually mean, and part of that is the shock and awe effect that it has, and for better or worse, when I've made excursions into teaching Nietzsche at university, taking that passage from the Gay Science and reading it out in the class, in the lecture theatre, it always gets a kind of a silence. I mean, the room does fall quiet at that point. And it seems to me that for someone who is so steeped in the 19th century, so steeped in the philosophy of the ancients, so steeped in his own experience of the collapse of faith, to take these things and to be able to silence people in the 21st century in such a magisterial way, that demands an explanation. And I suppose one of the things that I've tried to do in this book is to get at the heart of what is it that keeps drawing so many thinkers back time and again, and in various and in such diverse ways to this parabolic moment in Nietzsche.
Mm. So, do you think for Nietzsche this was a moment of sort of, a brainwave, a moment of genius where this all fell into place, or do you think that declaring God is dead was for him just an exhausting inevitability? Can we finally look around and just admit to this?
Yeah. Well, you were reminding me a moment ago that it's was it 180th birthday
today
of Nietzsche, and so 1844, and it's interesting if one thinks about two poems that are written in France on exactly that date or around about that date. A poem by Alfred de Vigny called Le Mont des Oliviers, so the Mount of Olives, obviously referring to the biblical passage in the New Testament, where we have it presents us with Christ alone in the Garden of Gethsemane, and surrounded by this immense silence. And at the end, it is in fact the silence that remains, what de Vigny calls the silence éternel de la divinité. So we have this silence, which is then in the same year, 1844, radicalized by Gérard de Nerval in his poem called Le Christ aux Oliviers. So Christ again in the on the Mount of Olives, and it's even more radical. Dieu n'est pas, Dieu n'est plus. He's there, he's suffering, and here we have very much a kind of atheist view of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. The answer, I think, for de Vigny is the political one of fraternity, which takes the place of religion. In the case of Gérard de Nerval, then he goes down the route of trying to investigate all kinds of mystery cults as alternatives to Christianity. But what Nietzsche does is to radicalize it by not simply saying there is no God, but that he's dead, and then even more radically, that we have killed him. And it's just, I can see how he aligns with what these two French thinkers are doing in 1844. And his version is so much more radical because, and I think that's one of the things that the figures that I look at in this book picked up upon, is that this has consequences for us. If we understand what it means, we all have skin in this game. And that maybe is something which is what still touches people today. It does arouse this awareness of them, of this might have something to do with me.
So one of the ways I was sort of taught to approach this back when I was studying my master's and doing the module on Nietzsche was a sort of pragmatic way to approach the death of God, is to actually replace the word God with Christendom. And you can see there that sort of, okay, this foundation as to why we would really do anything at all, or at least a justification for morals, for ethics, for social guidance, for any guidance altogether, suddenly is not, as you say, disproved, which is a completely different thing, but is mortalized and is dead. And I think that the God becoming mortal is, I think, the thing that separates it from, new atheism, where the discussion is about doesn't exist, toward it's the difference between not that it's impossible to believe, but because it doesn't exist, we've disproved it, but that we can no longer believe, and that seems to be the distinction there with turning God mortal, is that we just can't do this anymore. Am I on the right lines there of just a general appreciation just before we set forward of people reacting to it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's right. And it seems to me is what Jung means when he talks about the death of the symbol. Is that we inherit a culture which has an important religious symbolism, and of course, particularly he thinks the Judeo-Christian tradition, as far as the West is concerned. And we're left with this apparatus, but it doesn't work anymore. And he talks in Memories, Dreams, Reflections about how the myth simply doesn't speak to us, and that's not a matter which is, well, okay, done that, got the T-shirt, we can move on to something else. But he's Jung will say, and I think in this extent he's entirely coming out of Nietzsche, is the sense that, well, what does this mean for us in terms of, you talk about ethics, you could also therefore talk about politics. What does it mean for us personally, existentially? So we've got the root of existentialism, which is with Nietzsche as well. And it's, as you say, it's to do with the fact not simply that the institution of the church isn't seen as functioning, but it's symbols, it's rite, it's mystery, and what happens when all of that disappears? What does that mean for us as beings who have got this religion in our DNA? And that's, I think, something that Nietzsche is very concerned to show. That's why he's interested in genealogy, is that we come to this, we have been created out of these religious, out of these moral, ethical traditions, and therefore they have shaped us. And if they're taken away, this leaves, as it were, the famous God-shaped hole of the universe. But it's more than that. It's the end of the human-shaped hole as well, because our humanity has been defined through our religious experience.
And I guess if one was to stop their study of Nietzsche at that point, then perhaps they would be forgiven in falling into the Nietzsche is a nihilist camp. But of course, he then pushes forward to, he not only does he diagnose, he very quickly attempts, and I think this is probably where, in my own opinion, the weaker part of Nietzsche that just hasn't taken root and just hasn't landed as thoroughly as his diagnosis is his his prescription, which is the overcoming, the Übermensch, the tightrope from animal man to Superman. This overcoming is really, I think, where we find ourselves with this book, is a sort of death of God realism, where we say, okay, look, we accept your diagnosis, Dr. Nietzsche. No one is disagreeing with the symptoms of the death of God, but your attempt to overcome, your prescription, hasn't quite taken root.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And what I wanted to explore in the book was what seems to me a puzzling situation, is that given this widespread view of Nietzsche and as nihilist, and I think the right to question that, given the old graffiti joke, God is dead, Nietzsche is dead, God, and that kind of misunderstanding, that kind of banalization of it. Why is it that it is precisely among religious commentators and theologians that they see in Nietzsche a kind of precious resource for faith. And on the face of that, seems to me quite astonishing. And I think the more that I look at it, I still find it quite remarkable. But there is the sense that what Nietzsche exposes is the radicality of belief, which is how, real broad brushstrokes here, theologians in the 20th century seek to keep Christianity alive by emphasizing its existential nature, its psychological nature, by saying, well, what Nietzsche understands is that religion is something that has to be taken seriously. And that taking something seriously that's the crucial move. That's why there is a kind of pedagogical point here, a cultural point here, is that precisely in the way that he attacks religion, Nietzsche opens up a space for it to be recuperated. And I suppose one of the questions was that all part of the plan anyway from the beginning, or is that just a kind of happenstance that's taken place after?
That notion of taking it seriously is sort of a paradox unto itself, though, because it draws in the first thinker here, Papini, who states, well, deep down, and many commentators have said this since, often in a coy, sort of tongue-in-cheek way, and I don't think it's anything, but at the time it probably was, which is Papini is saying, deep down, Nietzsche is a Christian soul. So I guess one question there is, what does Papini mean by that? But also in that notion that you say Nietzsche's on about we have to take these things seriously, is kind of a paradoxical irony there, that it appears, if we're to take the idea that he has a Christian soul seriously, that he can only take the death of God seriously because he has a Christian soul.
Exactly. Yeah, no, exactly. I think, that's beautifully summarized. I think the paradox, and certainly the paradox as far as Papini sees it, and I think that what he's doing there as one of the first commentators to think about Nietzsche in relation to Christianity, is to say, well, what kind of a person is it who keeps going on about Christianity? And I think that is something that one needs to reflect on when reading Nietzsche. Is if religion is dead and over, if religion is gone and if God is dead and it's all over, then why keep going on about it? And she does, of course, right up to the Ecce Homo and its final dramatic question at the end about, have I been understood, Dionysus against the crucified? It's a problem that remains throughout his writing, and I think that Papini is very good at trying to say, look, only someone who is at root Christian would keep banging on about Christianity so much of the time, and it's perhaps not the most sophisticated of arguments, but I think it's shrewd, and I think there's a valuable insight.
And it seems that, I mean, just to throw in another German here, I mean, the difference between the two, both along the same lines, but Max Stirner would, he would take the other route here and say, well, he literally did just say, when someone wrote to him once, why are you even bothering talking about God? We all know that that's all over, and that was his bottom line on it. Whereas I think Nietzsche is more correct. It's a pretty open, abstract question, but do you think then that Nietzsche wished it wasn't? Do you think a part of him wished God wasn't dead?
And I think there is defense with Nietzsche of finding himself at a particular moment, and it's his duty to use this popular expression, to call out what's happening in religion, and I think his point is not that religion itself is it's its current articulation of it, and I think that's why he's upset in particular the way that 19th century theologians watered down Christianity, tried to rescue it by importing Hegelianism. So the case of David Friedrich Strauss would come to mind there. That they ignore the challenges to belief, which he thinks comes primarily from philology, the fact that it's impossible for us to understand what biblical texts would mean, and all the while, the established church waters down the radicalness of faith in order to make it acceptable, in order to accommodate it to the modern world. And Nietzsche, of course, is very much set against that kind of modernity. And that's what I think a number of the cultural commentators pick up on. Cultural commentators with theological background pick up upon in Nietzsche as well, is that his critique is not simply that about Christianity, not simply about the church, not simply about the institutions, but about the kind of society which allows those institutions to take that form. So it's a critique of us as moderns, a fortiori as postmoderns as well.
Well, I just wanted to add in another question there from that. You've sort of started gesturing towards it there, which is, if Nietzsche is the first to be really honest, he's saying, you know what, I'm going to call you out on this. But of course, he's still calling us out. He would probably argue, that quite literally billions of people are still not accepting that which he has seen. So he is accepting this sort of strange paradox that he's in, and he's calling it out and trying to find a way through it. And if such is the case, what does he think us moderns are doing that are, haven't, I guess... Yeah, I guess, what are we doing generally? Are we just lying to ourselves? Do we refuse to see our situation?
Well, of course, Nietzsche is, this is one particular trait, which is to recognize that there are certain articulations of religion which are doing very well. I mean, in the case of Islam, obviously comes to mind. Nietzsche doesn't talk about Islam very much, although occasionally he does. The remarks tend to be rather positive, and I think he likes the sort of the rigor, the discipline, and he would find that, I think he talks about in terms of being, as the opposite of the decadence, which he identifies with Christianity. And I think what's interesting is that some of the theologians I look at, someone like Henri de Lubac in particular, really take that criticism on the chin and say, look, what us decadents, hang on, guys, he might have a point here. And I think if one thinks about the great event in Catholic intellectual life of the 20th century being the Second Vatican Council, in many ways, one can see that entire council as being a response to Nietzsche and to the challenge that is there, and the hope that was there in those who ran the council, which was to revitalize, to have a aggiornamento, updating, and to revitalize Catholicism. One might say, well, it's not worked out quite like that, but it is significant that the previous Pope, Joseph Ratzinger, as Benedict, on a number of occasions refers to Nietzsche as saying, look, he takes it seriously, and that's the first step towards reinvigorating faith, is to see it as a genuine problem.
In what sense is that decadence?
I think what Nietzsche means by decadence is the watering down of dogma, the watering down of ethics and morality. I don't think Nietzsche would be very happy with a secular world which prioritizes the comfort of the individuals above anything else. We are all, I think, Nietzsche would say, die letzten Menschen, the last human beings against whom Zarathustra fulminates in Das Spake Zarathustra. And what do the last human beings say in Zarathustra? We've discovered happiness, they say, and blink. And I think that's what Nietzsche sees as decadence. And in a world where we all too easily fly off the handle when the Amazon package doesn't arrive us at the date and time as promised, Nietzsche is saying, well, you guys have completely missed the plot in terms of what it means to be a human being, what it means to create yourself, to cultivate yourself. And I think that's That's why he sees the death of God as being, in a sense, the death of humankind as well.
But then again, Nietzsche didn't have next day delivery, so he didn't understand the full enjoyment and comfort of being a last man, which, maybe he would have come round to the end of history if he'd have seen the wonders.
You think if he'd instead of wandering around Sils Maria, if he'd just gone down to the gym on a more regular basis?
I think so. Maybe if he'd had some better remedies for his illnesses instead of herbal cigarettes and milk or whatever it was, he might have been a bit more joyous. There you go. So moving to another thinker who is largely forgotten in the existentialist sphere. So here, that's sort of very thorough foundation of where we're at with the death of God. And so, according to one Karl Jaspers, we're cursed. We have the Nietzschean cursed from now on.
That's right. Now it's interesting that Jaspers he gives a lecture when 1938 when he's giving an address to extraordinary organization, or I say extraordinary. It's called the Wissenschaftliches Predigerverein. So it would be sort of the Association of Professional Sermon Givers, and he gives a lecture entitled Nietzsche and Christianity. An identically titled work is written by someone called Hans Egert Schröder, who is a follower of Klages and who probably is one of the people who gets Klages into the trouble that he does by writing a book with an identical title to Jaspers, but it's much more of a right-wing political screed. So, but it's interesting that across this platform, we've got people across the entire political spectrum. You've got people writing about Nietzsche and writing identically titled books. In the case of Jaspers, who I think we've much rather focused upon, this curse, I think, is related to what I was saying a moment ago about the effect that all of this has on us. Jaspers says, anyone who allows themselves to be seduced by Nietzsche into the sophistries of his mere sentences, into the appearance of having recognized something, into the intoxication of the extreme, into the arbitrariness of the drives, has already been afflicted by his curse. So the curse is, interestingly, that even Nietzsche is not radical enough as far as Jaspers is concerned. He sees, I think, essentially a rhetorical problem with Nietzsche. And I think Jaspers, and again, remember his audience, he's talking to ministers who are going to hold sermons and so on. So this is all about recuperating Christianity. I think that what he sees as being the problem with Nietzsche is the danger to get caught up in this extraordinarily powerful rhetoric, which I was praising, and I think one would for being able to cut through so much of our decadent lack of interest. And at the end, Jaspers says it's no friendly conclusion with which Nietzsche departs, and he fails us because everything is placed on us. Only that is true, he says, which through Nietzsche comes out of us ourselves. So what Jaspers is identifying there is something which I would say is very, very positive and important with Nietzsche, which is that it's not simply about how does Nietzsche stand in relation to the death of God. It is how do we as individuals relate and have ownership and find a solution to that problem. So I think Jaspers's curse on Nietzsche is kind of a reversal of what Nietzsche does in the Antichrist, which is described as a curse from Christianity. What Jaspers is doing is kind of turning it round and, as it were, trying to see Nietzsche as hoist with his own petard.
I feel like that, to use that metaphor, though, I feel like that petard does slip on past and fall back on Jaspers' own, hoist him up instead, because does he comment on the irony of the fact that in writing such an argument, he himself is perhaps more caught up than anyone?
I don't think there's a lot of irony in Jaspers.
Okay.
That it would be true to say. But I think what he's doing is, and again, remembering the audience that he has, is identifying Nietzsche as significant to be engaged with, and so he's picking up this topic. It's reflected there in the title of Nietzsche and Christianity. It is defensive in a way, as far as Christianity is concerned, and it is highly critical of Nietzsche. But the fact that he, as it were, accepts the challenge implicitly to debate with Nietzsche, that's where it seems to be that it's signaling what's happening in Nietzsche is still going to be significant to us, even though one might think, well, with 1938, they might have had other things that they should have been worried about going on in the world.
Mm-hmm. So this also brings us to, if we're all possibly cursed as individuals, we've spoken of the last men. How does Eric Chavara, who have previously done a podcast on Chavara, how does he see the Nietzschean individual, as he names it?
That's right. Well, Chavara, I think, is significant both because of his recuperation of this phrase about the analogia entis. So anyone who can take a dry scholastic term and turn it into a project which is as fascinating and absorbing as it is in his book of that name, I mean, that's quite a considerable achievement. It also shows, I think, how contrary to what one might think, that there are a lot of people who are quite happy to keep on believing and doing so in a kind of relatively unproblematic way. Certainly, Chavara sees scholastic theology as entirely viable in the 20th century. In a more simplistic way, perhaps some French poets like Paul Claudel identify themselves as Catholic in an entirely unproblematic way. I mean, they'll give of going to Vespers in Notre Dame Cathedral, and suddenly he says, "Je crois." I just started to believe. So, some people, it is possible, despite what Nietzsche says, to have a faith, have a practiced and a reflected faith. But what I see, one of the things that I think is remarkable about Chavara's engagement with Nietzsche is that he writes this a beautiful article where he compares Nietzsche, or he reads Nietzsche along with Ignatius of Loyola and St. Thomas Aquinas. And simply to have those, it's kind of, an early version of your Hermitix question that you used to have about if you put three thinkers in a room, who would they be and who could listen to the conversation? And what Chavara does is to develop a conversation, a dialogue, a trialogue, an exchange between Thomas Aquinas, Ignatius of Loyola, themselves representing different points on the spectrum of Catholicism, and then Nietzsche as a kind of third and in some sense mediating, in some sense jointly inheriting figure as well. And I think simply to have those three names that are brought together and not simply thrown into a pot, but very sensitively and intelligently explored, I think it's one of the most interesting pieces of work that's been done in the 20th century on Nietzsche.
Hmm. So, just to focus on it, what is the Nietzschean individual? Is it that person who's sort of who has sort of become caught up and hasn't acknowledged that one can still just have faith? They're caught in that questioning.
I think by the Nietzschean individual, he's talking about the concept of the Übermensch, so hard satisfactory to translate, Superman, the Übermensch. But as part of this rhetorical strategy that Chavara has of always talking about, he has this wonderful phrase, "Je über hinaus," so always going beyond. And there is a very intense rhetoric of transcendence that one finds in Chavara and in the study of analogia entis. And I think what he means by the Nietzschean individual is someone who is always seeking to transcend and ever more transcendent. I try to capture this Je über hinaus and this very specific language that he uses. I think that's what he means by the Nietzschean individual. Mm-hmm. That someone who's always going to move up to another level. That's why I think that the whole point about the Übermensch is that there is something aspirational about it. The Übermensch is not something that is going to be achieved. You can say, okay, let's have a committee. We'll work out what we should have to be an Übermensch, and we'll put together some strategies, and then we'll go and realize it, and then we're done. But it's always going to go beyond. And even if there are figures in the past that Nietzsche can point to, I'm thinking of Goethe in particular as kind of the Übermensch for their day. Ultimately, it's always going to remain a figure that is trying to go a little bit further along that rope, to pick up the image that you were quoting from Zarathustra earlier, between the animal and the Übermensch. We're always going to be on a journey there. We're never going to entirely get there, and that's the point. And that is a dynamic, I think, which Shivara understands particularly well, and which he tries to convey in this extraordinary rhetoric of Je über hinaus, which he uses time and again.
It seems then that Shivara's individual would be somewhat of a, I'm not sure if he inherently relates it to this, but it seems that in that sense it would be somewhat of a failure. If we think of the tightrope, I think probably even Nietzsche would say that most moderns have probably likely for him and his appreciation have fallen further back the other way towards the animal, hedonism, happiness, closer to the last man, and that the ambition of the Übermensch has really been immanentized. the eschaton of the Übermensch has been immanentized into the culture of the last man. So yeah, we may very well have infinite ambition, but it's basically been possessed by the infinite money spirit, money guys.
I think that's a very persuasive. I think that's very persuasive reading that you're offering that, James. I mean, to use a different phrase that one finds in Nietzsche. He talks about being an aristocratic radical. Shivara identifies this with what he calls the agonal individual, and of course the agon is another key idea that one finds in Nietzsche. So the struggle, the fight, the fact that what makes the agon important is the engagement with another person and with another problem. It's not simply, it doesn't have this sort of outcome focus, which is so relentless and omnipresent today. But there's a nice phrase, okay, aristocratic, radical, agonal individual. What Shivara does, paraphrasing a number of expressions that one finds in Nietzsche, he says, and I think this would be the Nietzschean individual that we're asking about, he says that is someone who is a wanderer among masks, a sufferer amid laughter, a flame bursting forth in solitude. And I think he's wonderfully packaged together there, kind of some great Nietzschean sound bites, and all of which are trying to get that sense of the journey of transcendence is something that will not come to an end, but what matters is that we place ourselves at the beginning of that journey and follow it as far as we can.
Okay. So I can't segue into the next bit smoothly, unfortunately. But this next quote from de Lubac was for me, I think, I know it's something that we both feel personally about, and perhaps we both agree is, I don't want to say the real crisis. We spoke earlier of what is meant by the death of God, and there is some sort of easier argument, or maybe not an easier means to say, really, it's the death of the sacred and the realization that perhaps is the larger problem at stake. And it makes me think, you spoke of the Second Vatican II earlier, and we are now in this sort of last man bureaucratic world that seeks to have reason and control over everything. And you can have, the next, we'll do a new catechism, even more dogma, even more rules. But if the flame of to use a very quick metaphor there, the flame of the sacred just isn't there, something is irretrievable. So there's this fantastic quote by Honoré de Lubac: "Do the unbelievers who jostle us at every turn observe on our brows the radiance of that gladness which 20 centuries ago captivated the fine flower of the pagan world? Are our hearts the hearts of men risen with Christ?" I don't think he's really talking about, I mean, the notion of a heart, right? The notion of the flame of faith, that sacred, divine reality of a spiritual appreciation. You could, are our hearts risen with Christ? I think read between the lines is you can go to church every Sunday, but are you truly, is your heart with Christ? And so this seems to me to be to do with the sacred, which I think is what we've really lost. I think that's what's really died. That's actually the important thing here. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I again would find that a very, very plausible account. I mean, de Lubac has this wonderful book, the drama of atheist humanism, and the drama is partly there because of the figures themselves that he looks at. So Feuerbach being one, Nietzsche being another one, Marx, of course, as a key figure as well in this intellectual history. But the drama is also one that affects the believers as well. And I think it's interesting to note that there is a curious sense in Nietzsche that he appreciates some aspects of the church. And I'm thinking of the passage in Zarathustra called "Of the Priests," where Nietzsche describes the priests as being prisoners, stigmatized ones, but he says they are also not dissimilar to me, says in speaking in Zarathustra's voice. And that passage that you read from de Lubac seems to me to restate that moment when Zarathustra says, "Better songs would they have to sing for me to believe their Saviour, more like saved ones would his disciples have to appear unto me." And so the people who speak on behalf of Christianity, yet without that sense of reverence for the sacred or awareness of the sacred, Nietzsche would say they're the ones that are letting the side down. They are the ones who are to use this model that he presents with. They are killing God. And I think that's the radicalness of it. That is, it's God, but that we have killed him. And I think that's the bit where that's what, in part, brings out the silence in the room and gives us all pause for thought, because it means that we as individuals have to respond in an existentially and emotionally mature way to this historical moment in which we find ourselves, rather than trying to hide it away. And I think that Lubac's book is one of the great examples of intellectual history written in the 20th century. Same thing goes for the work of Cornelio Fabro as well, where he writes this great book, translated into English but not been reprinted for a long time, Modern Atheism, which is an entire conspectus of about 600 pages, where he examines the roots of atheism in the ancient world and follows it right through into the 20th century. And I think that de Lubac and Favreau together they offer a wonderful intellectual toolkit for trying to understand how Nietzsche fits into this historical moment that we've been discussing today.
Mm. There's something very intriguing there, and so there's a couple of things. One is to do with the Latin Mass, which we can get to because we mentioned it before. But this notion of "we have killed him," it seems, has a strange mirroring with the Mass in relation to the crucifixion, wherein the parishioners, or let's just say the audience, in the readings of the Mass, usually the priest reads Christ sections and then someone else reads whoever, but the parishioners, the audience, play the role of the audience who are damning Christ, and in that you end up half yelling out, "Kill him." And so there's a strange mirroring here between that as the moment unto which we see that we are killing God, but God is dying for our sins. And for Nietzsche at the same time doing this, but Nietzsche's murder is a failure. There's nothing that's being redeemed.
Uh-huh. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And it's interesting that when he's giving his lectures on Marxism, Thomas Merton makes, I think, a very important point where he talks about the crisis of faith as actually being also a crisis of atheism. Because he says it's not just a crisis of faith, it's a crisis of those who are anti-faith as well, because he says they just don't care. He says this is what, speaking to those people who are trained to be a priest, he says this is what you've got to understand. Some people, he says, they wouldn't walk across the street even to be an atheist. They don't want any convictions about anything. And that, I think, is the crucial insight that goes with that point that you were making about how a participatory liturgy would work. You were referencing there, really, I think, the Good Friday liturgy. And, of course, if anything was most hotly debated in terms of the liturgical debate of the 20th century, it was the revision that went on to the Easter Triduum, those 3 days leading up to Easter, and I think that iconic moment could be played with, could be changed, could be updated. Is one of the lasting problems that the church has in speaking to people. I mean, we are at a moment where church buildings across the piece are being closed down. In particular, Anglican churches are struggling, and there are very, very disturbing commentators within the church about what's happening in terms of can management save the church from its current predicament. But that, I think, what Merton shows is people have understood this for many decades now, and it all goes back. It's all kicked off with their response to Nietzsche. When in the parable, the madman goes around the churches, he says, "Well, these are just the sepulchres of God." But he says it's going to take centuries for the news to reach them. It is like the light coming from a star that's far away. And so it's not surprising that it is a gradual process of coming to terms with the enormity of what we've done. And I think that some of the thinkers in this that I've tried to explore in this book, for me, have had the value of trying to show exactly what is at stake and why it is not something that one ought to just simply walk away from, even though many people do.
And yet for Marcel, this huge sort of blazing star that is this problem can still just be a choice, can be a fairly simple choice.
Exactly. Again, just as you have the Paul Claudels who simply go off and hear a liturgical service and are able to convert on the spot. And there is a particular, I think, very strong tradition within French literature. Not for nothing that I was talking about de Vigny and Gérard de Nerval earlier. Charles Péguy as being a very, very important poet, but also social critic as well. Very important for people like Gabriel Marcel. Very important for people like Emmanuel Mounier. But Marcel has this great line where he says, well, the death of God, he says, we have to understand it as a starting point. He says, it's something like a trampoline for a magnificent leap, for the creative élan, very Becksovian term there, without which the Superman or the superhuman is unthinkable. So I think that what Marcel is doing, like other commentators too, like Martin Heidegger, is to see within Nietzsche a kind of resource for. I think Gabriel Marcel will be a different kind of existentialism from what's proposed by Heidegger. But as someone who sees the death of God, he says, well, that's the starting point. The death of God is not the end; it's the starting point. I think again of Jung and that moment in the Red Book when, in the first of the seven sermons to the dead, Basilides says, "Well, look, God is not dead; He is more alive than ever." And so there are people who pick up this défi, pick up this challenge. And what's interesting is Jung, okay, very much a figure who is outside of the church, but inside of the church or aligned with the church, an amazing number of thinkers as well.
With that notion, the reference there to Elan, with this, the Übermensch being, and this ambition that we were speaking about earlier being unthinkable without the Elan, without this sort of Dionysian vitality, I assume. It appears, and certainly feels when I step out of my door, that we have then ended up in the worst of all possible Nietzschean worlds, where we have accepted the death of God as the end, but we also haven't, that entails that we haven't really used it as a means to go forward. So we've become last men who haven't really, it's just absolutely like some sort of strange sludge, because we don't have any vitalism, but we also haven't tried to rekindle anything. But at the same time, many would argue, as I mentioned before in our last chat, that Zizek would say that God is alive in the unconscious. So we've sort of ended up with this Old Testament morals in a body without vitalism that it equally isn't trying to push forward, and has become a stagnant last man.
Well, I mean, there is a reason why Nietzsche went mad.
Yeah, there you go.
But he could see where all this was coming from. But I think that's why I find it interesting that a thinker like René Girard, who I would agree is probably much better known than many of the other figures that I discuss in the book, but still not well known enough, despite I think his very, very plausible explanatory value for why violence, why conflict keeps occurring, and I think that Girard is one of the commentators who is one of the most radical critics that I think Nietzsche has. As always with Jaspers, that's kind of a way of paying a backhanded compliment to Nietzsche. But of course, what you're describing there seems to me very, in terms of the social moment where we find ourselves, is very akin, that I would say, to what Girard thinks about the 20th century when he talks about the other totalitarianism, and this other totalitarianism being the kind of culture of empathy, victimhood. I think he's a kind of a critic of woke before his time, and he will go so far as to say, well, that is really a totalitarianism which we have inherited through this appropriation of Nietzsche, a kind of restoration, Girard goes so far to say, of a neo-paganism. I have to say I don't find Girard persuasive on all the points that he makes about Nietzsche, but he's certainly, I think, been able to take his notion of mimetic violence and use it as a prism for social critique in ways which is worthy of more discussion than it gets at the moment.
But we should add, I mean, one of these reactions, as it's a book of reactions, and I think it is, just as me speaking, I do think it's the one where I couldn't necessarily follow Girard's line of thought, and actually I just thought it was quite lazy, to be frank, But it needs saying, which is that Girard sees the death of God as a line. Speaking of Animal Man, Superman, he sees it as a line of death of God through to Nazism and then through to Heidegger. And yeah, I mean, can you explain? Because I think I could follow it, but I just found it a bit haphazard.
It's very schematic. I would agree with that. And again, one should note, on the one hand, Girard is a thinker who seems to have had a deep personal faith. I mean, has this one line where he's talking about how he used to go on all these train journeys when he was teaching at two different universities, and he would like the sight of the sunlight shining on the buildings as he went past, a kind of aesthetic moment, perhaps, rather than religious moment, and someone who was very invested, I think, in the values of the traditional Latin Mass, the Tridentine Mass as well, I believe. So quite kind of hardcore, one might say, from that point of view. And yet, nevertheless, he's also putting these comments out there as a responsible intellectual figure in his own right. So I think it's perfectly fair to criticize them for being overly schematic. I think Girard's problem is that he is so steeped in his own explanatory system that he often goes a little bit too fast when he's trying to explain it. But I think it's interesting that he fingers Heidegger as being one of the bad boys, and in particular because he sees Heidegger as undermining Christianity in a very radical way. Far more radical than Nietzsche, I think, is that in terms of the damage that they do, Heidegger, he thinks, and he's not alone in this, that the critique of Heidegger is that he is, as Hannah Arendt called him, the sly fox, that he creeps into 20th century theological discourse and subverts it from within. And externally, all this talk about being and the mystery of being and so on looks as if it's something which is very compatible with Christianity. But I think the critics are right in that many ways. Heidegger is the bigger problem because he's the bomb within that's going to destroy the edifice of Christian faith.
Heidegger doesn't have a Christian soul. Certainly
not as an individual, he appears not to have done that.
Well, no, but also in in the notion of Christian soul as I mentioned this quote that I somehow found in relation to Schopenhauer about Schopenhauer states somewhere, so don't quote me on this. It may have been someone else saying this about Schopenhauer. But Schopenhauer admits that his work is still founded within the candle flame started by Christianity, and I think Nietzsche, with this Christian soul, is still not only would admit, at least to some indebtedness, not in the sense that it doesn't mean for Nietzsche that it's correct, but some indebtedness to that historical continuation, and Nietzsche himself perhaps wrestling with that candle flame. But as you say, and as you reference, and I'm in agreement with it, Heidegger comes in and he is, he's not even abusive with the candle flame. He's sort of nonchalant about, like, just plucking it out with his fingers and then moving on. He doesn't retain. He doesn't. I think Nietzsche is always in dialogue through his language, and his style is always in dialogue with whatever the sacred might be, with his bombastic, poetic nature, his internal nature that he has. Heidegger is much more like a sort of middle manager, just getting on with the truth of things. Really, yeah. What would you say if we were to go with that candle flame metaphor? How do you think Heidegger treats it?
I mean, what we get is in Heidegger, for whom I have to say I do have a lot of time, and he's much maligned from outside. I think for the wrong reason. I can think of lots of reasons not to like Heidegger, but it's got nothing to do with the alleged political position that he has, or his failure to adequately denounce his affiliations in the Third Reich. I mean, my point is simply, he wasn't the only professor who went around with a swastika on his arm. That doesn't justify it, but it's one which is coming up at the moment against him. Rather, I would see the problem with Heidegger as being the way that he does present a kind of revival of a kind of very simplistic Gnosticism, a narrative of loss of the sense of being. The point is, with Heidegger, what's his doctrine of salvation? And the salvation is going to come not from the church; it's going to come from Heidegger. was going to come from those who invest in his system. And I think that all thinkers perhaps have a kind of ambition that they want to convert people to their cause, and that's why they write books and so on. But I think there's a number of the commentators that I've explored in this volume, Girard in particular, Cornelio Fabro being another one. The problem with Heidegger is that you think you're getting religion, you think that you're getting the mystery of being, you think that you're getting the real thing, but you're not, and that's the danger of it.
Dare I ask, what are you getting?
I think what you're getting is a reworking of Gnosticism. Nothing wrong with Gnosticism. And Hans Jonas and other thinkers, Gnosticism is explored and expounded in some cases in very useful and instructive ways in the 20th century. No, I think the point about Heidegger is that at the end of the day, you're going to become a Heideggerian. And even Gnostics will say you're not going to become a Heideggerian if salvation's what you're after.
Okay.
There's no goddess Sophia in Being and Time.
No. You'd have to go to your little hut in the woods and then go watch football on TV down the pub.
It has to be somebody else's television because, of course, you don't believe in technology if you're Heidegger.
Exactly. You don't believe in it. Yeah. But you do need to keep up with the football games. Yeah. And you wear a little hat. Wear a little woolly hat that your wife has knitted for you. Fantastic.
I think you're othering a Heidegger there in those remarks, but I do share where you're coming from there, and I think that it's one of the peculiar things in 20th century theology has been its appropriation of Heidegger, and one might say, has that overall been a contribution to how Christianity presents itself, Catholicism in particular, or has it rather been one of the less obvious reasons for its failure to persuade and convince?
Is there anything you'd like to add about your book that you feel is key that we've overlooked?
I've enjoyed our conversation. I think we've explored the main ideas which I put forward in the book. I suppose I just end by remembering that remark that Barbe d'Aurevilly makes about Joris Karl Huysmans after he's published that great novel Aberbourg. He says, after you've done that, Joris Karl, he says, you've got two alternatives: the mouth of a pistol or the foot of the cross. And maybe the same can be said for us still today.
Can I say that I disagree with that? That's the unfortunate thing is that I completely disagree with that, because there is the third, mouth of a pistol, or I would say you have three options. You have the mouth of the pistol, the foot of the cross, or you just completely apathetic to the whole discussion and live the life of a last man.
Well, in a sense, that's what Merton is drawing attention to. What I would say to that is there might be a reaction, that might be a response, but is it a solution, and is it a way that if one takes that urgency that we've been discussing of the problem, is that facing up to it, or is it a strategy which has a momentary success to it, or even a longer term success to it? But at the end, what is being repressed in that walking away from the problem is going to return.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. What are you working on now? Oh, sorry. Did you want to add something?
No, I'm simply going to say. I mean, I'm not trying to convert you to any particular point of view on that. On that, but it seems to me that on all of these thinkers there is an urgency which I think I've detected in your own comments and questions that we've been talking about, in your own remarks, in particular, where you talk about how Geist has invaded the church, and I just wanted to hold that as a kind of particular closing thought. What I'm working on at the moment is Goethe's Faust, in relation to this ongoing project to write about the epic of transformation. So I'm deep in the moment in the Aegean Sea Festival and enjoying every moment of it.
Fantastic. Well, Paul Bishop, it's been a great conversation once again. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, James. Appreciate it. Thank you.